Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers with your host, Ben Siders. That's me. And the other guy is, as always, Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise.
We are intellectual property lawyers and certified geeks practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders. You can find Kirk at KirkDMN. And you can follow this podcast on Twitter at LGGPod. Is it LGGPod or LGG Podcast, Kirk? I don't have my sheet in front of me.
I thought it's podcast.
I think it's lggpodcast.com. I think the email is lggpod. You can tell how many people tweet at us by how well we know these things. Or
it is lggpodcast.com.
I knew it all along. I was testing Kirk. We are here for season 4 of LGG Podcast, episode 2. It is late January, and today's episode is going to be maybe something, a tradition will start, Public Domain Day. All the public domain works are, well, a bunch of copyrights have expired, and a bunch of new works entered the public domain on January 1 of this year. And we thought it would be fun to kind of talk about what some of those are, because as we mentioned in a prior episode, I think it was one of our character copyright episodes, there was an enormous amount of influential cultural works that were developed in the United States and published or released in the 1920s. And we are halfway through that decade of work. So stuff that was published originally in 1925 entered the public domain on January 1 of this year. And there's some big names in that list, Kirk.
Yeah, there is. And I think it makes sense to talk about the fact. I think anybody who's done anything associated with, literature, you tend to bump into the 1920s, oftentimes being referred to as sort of one of the great decades of American literature. A lot of people we think of as sort of the great American novelists are from the 1920s. You're the English major, so you can do more about this than I can. But it's one of those where it does seem like that's a very important decade. And it's worth noting that that's the works we're talking about right now entering the public domain. So we're talking very much about American literature.
Yeah, for sure. You got Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, although he's pretty much only known for one book. Faulkner was writing around this time, T.S. Eliot. There's a lot of stuff. And you also have, in parallel with this, a lot of influential musical works. We have the rise of jazz, yep. and sort of the emergence of I guess I'd say early versions of what we call pop music now. We're seeing a lot of evolution there. And film also. The film industry really starts to take off in the 1920s. We see the introduction of films that actually have audio tracks.
Sound.
1925, I don't think yet. I think they're still using word boards, but
I believe that's correct. Yeah, I think we're still talking. We don't have talkies yet.
The talkies. Yeah, we were just talking before we started. Like the evolution of audio recording technology actually, in some respects, lagged behind video recording. I mean, we had movies before we could really effectively synchronize the sound with them. It was just too difficult to do both at once. So there's a lot of stuff that's entering the public domain, and probably the one of the first oddities of the way this works is, regardless of when they were published in 1925, they all entered the public domain at the same time, January 1st of 2021.
Yep.
So we were just saying that means you should have published on January 2nd and squeeze out an extra year of copyright term out of your books.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to publish on December 31st. I mean, that's the...
That's like when I had my oldest daughter. She was born on January 9th. I'm like, really? We couldn't squeeze this out 10 days before and get the tax deduction for that year, too?
Whereas for anybody who is from us in St. Louis and personal property taxes, everybody also knows you never buy a car in December. You always buy it in January for similar
exactly right. Exactly right. So let's talk about some of this stuff. One of the more interesting ones is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which virtually everybody listening to this has probably read at least once, interestingly, except for Kirk.
Yeah, and so this is the joke about it. We were talking about this ahead of time. You talk about, that these are the works that are incredibly influential, known through high school, so we all encounter them at school and we're assigned them. I never read The Great Gatsby. Now, I have seen the modern movie of it. I've not seen the older movies, but I have seen
Who was in that? Was that the Leonardo version?
Leonardo DiCaprio, yeah. And so, and it was a while ago I saw it, but I did want to see it. But I think it's just the nature of my English. I mean, I actually took AP English in high school, but the teacher I had was one very into Shakespeare. And so we studied a lot of sort of Shakespeare, but she was also very open in what you were allowed to read in conjunction with reading sort of literature. So we were given basically, you have to read something from this time period. Here are authors which are acceptable. Pick a book and read it. And so, I read Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities in that, but that's kind of the one that the only one that a lot of people have ever heard of. I read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which most people know as the plot line of Apocalypse Now.
Mm-hmm.
But and that was the book that taught me I need annotated versions, because if anybody who's read Heart of Darkness, you have to have read like 100 pieces of literature.
Yeah, it's pretty inaccessible.
At which point in time, Heart of Darkness becomes an absolutely brilliant work if you understand the 100 works that it's based on.
Well, those historical novels too, like a lot of them are set in their time period. Like I've heard several times. So I was an English major, and at some point about 10 years ago, I was like, all right, I want to read before I die all of the greatest literature of all time. So did a bunch of research on what is considered to be the greatest novel ever written. And the only consensus, to the extent that there is one that I've seen, is Brothers Karamazov. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but probably Karamazov. So I'm like, oh, great. Russian literature, not my favorite, although I have enjoyed some of like Kafka's short stories and stuff like that. There's some good stuff in there. The shorter works I enjoy more. But I bought an annotated version because I know a lot of the plot line revolves around the Eastern Orthodox Church, and I just don't understand how it's structured and like the cultural implications of people's roles and responsibilities in that church. So I bought an annotated version that I thought would drop footnotes and explain to me what all these different positions are. No, it mostly was just translations of or explanations of Russian words that don't have an English translation at all. Like, well, I don't need you to explain borscht to me,
It's beet soup. It's pretty good too, actually.
Like, I need to know what all these things are. So I got about 4 chapters into it. I did like it, but I've never actually finished it. So, but that's beside the point. The Brothers Karamazov is not entering the public domain here yet, or it already has, one of the two. But Great Gatsby is usually also on that list as one of the greatest works of fiction of all time. Certainly one of, if not the greatest American novel of all time. Didn't care for it myself. I found the characters to be unlikable, perhaps by design, I don't know, and inaccessible. So for those of you who have read it, we have, regardless of whether you like the book or not, it's indisputably one of the most influential novels in the history of the country. And so it is now public domain, and a lot can be done with it. Kirk, what does that mean? So what can we do with The Great Gatsby now? Clearly, people were making movies before. We just talked about one that was made a couple years ago. How did they get to do that? And what difference does it make if it's public domain now?
Yep. So public domain, and the sort of simple answer to public domain, means owned by the public. So at this point in time, essentially, there is no ownership right to any individual, or in this case, his estate, that owns the rights to, at this point in time, The Great Gatsby, the novel. And we should put into the fact this is just the novel, just the book. We'll talk a little bit about that differently, but in a few minutes. But it's one of those where what we're really talking about is that nobody now owns rights in it. The public owns rights in it, and the public can do whatever they want with it. What this means is if you want to go get The Great Gatsby, you want to take the book, you want to write a screenplay from it, there is absolutely nothing anybody associated with F. Scott Fitzgerald can do to you.
I'm just going to publish it and sell copies. Anybody can do it.
Or just publish it and sell copies.
Well, why would you buy them? Anybody else can do that too.
And stuff like that. So it's one of those where you really have these things that basically say at this point in time, you can do anything you'd like in conjunction with the work. And basically the original rights holders, the rights holders that held the rights in 2020 cannot do anything to stop you.
So here's a perhaps academic question on multiple levels. Does this mean now that for the rest of time, nobody studying English in an American college is ever going to have to pay for a paperback copy of Great Gatsby again? I guess I'm aging myself a little bit. People probably don't use paperback books anymore in college, but so I find a copy at my local bookstore and I want to charge $20 for it. How can I do that? What makes that copyrightable? Why can't I just go get my own?
Well, one, it doesn't have to be copyrightable in order for them to charge you $20 to do it.
If I'm a sucker and I buy
it, we can talk about capitalism all we like, because it is kind of a focus of The Great Gatsby. But the thing with it is, at this point in time, what you're basically looking at is the individual copies that are made may still have copyrights in them. So, example, we talked about annotated copies earlier.
Yeah.
If somebody does an annotated copy of The Great Gatsby, the annotations have a copyright separately than the book itself.
Yep.
And that's probably going to be later. One presume it is later, because you can't do an annotated version until the novel itself is in existence. So since The Great Gatsby expired today, in January 1st, any annotated version is going to have a longer copyright, presumably because it has to have been generated after The Great Gatsby itself. So you can look at it and sort of say those kind of things. Similarly, I talked about, the Leonardo DiCaprio movie that has its own copyright. You can't make, go out and make videotape copies of The Great Gatsby, the movie, but you could make your own movie. If you actually wanted to go out and say, I want to perform The Great Gatsby, I want to do a movie of it. You write your own screenplay based upon The Great Gatsby. Those are things that, can't be stopped. You could do translations in the same way. You can translate this into other languages. If somebody wants to write, The Great Gatsby in Klingon, they're totally entitled to do that. Nobody can stop them. So those are the kind of things that you can be looking at, in conjunction with that. Actually, as you think about it, translating to Klingon doesn't make nearly as much sense as translating into Ferengi.
Yeah, Ferengi makes much more sense. J, they can rename it to Jay Gats in the quest for gold pressed Latin.
As bad as it is, I could totally see somebody doing that. It would probably be hilarious. but
then Daisy Buchanan has to be like a Bajoran or something. This is getting really off the rails.
It was getting off the rails,
but up to our billing as the nerd podcast.
But it would also, I have to admit, that would actually be really fun.
See, that I'd watch, right?
Or we might all enjoy it. Yeah, it might be better than the other movie adaptations that have ever been made.
Speaking of the other one, so presumably they had to go to Fitzgerald's estate and get the rights to make that movie. That just came out like less than 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, it's a relatively recent movie. I don't know exactly when it came out, but it's definitely a recent movie. Now there's older movies of The Great Gatsby as well. I think the first one was made in 1930. If I remember correctly, is the oldest one. It was actually done to promote the book. I'm going to mention it just in conjunction with this. I happened to this morning, I listened to a bunch of other podcasts. As I was going through and figuring out what podcasts to listen to this morning, I happened to notice that one of the podcasts I listened to, which I'm going to plug briefly, is secretly incredibly fascinating. It's Alex Schmidt. For you guys who know him, he used to do the Cracked podcast. He has his own podcast now, and he basically goes into sort of, fascinating statistics and everything about the random things. He happened to do one on The Great Gatsby. So I purposely listened to it this morning to see what he had for, interesting statistics and information about it. That was one of the things he talked about in conjunction with it, is the fact that they were trying to promote the book. They made a movie of it early and it didn't work. So I thought that was interesting.
I'm shocked that people in the 1920s were not receptive to a literary criticism of their avarice.
Well, part of it they said, and again, I'm basing this upon that podcast, is he said the comments that were at the time, people kind of may have treated it more like it was supposed to be a contemporary pulp fiction novel, which it wasn't, and they really weren't interested in it.
I can see that. I mean, having read it, it does have some of those elements to it. And I read it in high school during my English major, and then once after I graduated. And each time I took something different away from it. Although I never enjoyed any of, I didn't like the story or the characters any of those times. But I would say when I read it in college, I probably appreciated it the most for its cultural impact and for its overall themes and messages. And high school is just like it's a bunch of rich people screwing around. I don't care.
Yeah, and I think the thing you really get into, I don't think the characters are supposed to be likable. I mean, they're supposed to be rich, they are jazz age people, as to what you have from it. And that's he'd written a number of books using those as characters. One of the things he do talk about, which I thought was interesting when we think about it, is F. Scott Fitzgerald as well. The Great Gatsby was one of his last works. And so that means that actually most of his body of work at this point in time is in the public domain, if not all of it. And so it's one of those things where, it's interesting to think about that this being the sort of potentially last novel, him having a lot of those potentially common themes. There's a lot now people can use in the public domain related to his bodies of work. The other thing that I think is just really, really intriguing about it, and I love this. I love using The Great Gatsby as a reference in public domain, because the whole central premise of Great Gatsby is critiques of capitalism.
Yes.
And the public domain is nothing, it's very much a true sort of capitalist statement. And so, you kind of bump into this, and The Great Gatsby almost becomes a great analogy for itself, which is kind of an intriguing sort of piece behind it.
Definitely. Along those lines, one other thing I just thought of that, people should be careful of when they're looking at public domain issues. The novel itself is public domain, but that doesn't necessarily apply to things like forewords, afterwards. Yep. We mentioned annotations already, but also cover art.
Yeah, cover art is definitely can be an issue. The cover art is primarily usually seen the sort of blue background.
Yeah.
My understanding that is the first edition. That
is
was
it really?
The original one published from him. So that is the sort of the well-known, sort of thing,
So you'd think that would be public domain as well, then.
It may be slightly, again, you don't necessarily know exactly the dates as to where these things are. It potentially should be.
If that particular image was released earlier, it could have already been public domain independently of the book. Who knows? So let's cover a couple other that are interesting here. Kirk and I are looking at there's Duke Law has a website, Public Domain Day, where they kind of track major works entering the public domain. Another one we're not going to cover in any detail is In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway. I've read that too as part of my English degree, and it's sort of a post-World War I grappling with coming back to civilian life book. Typical Hemingway. If you like Hemingway, you'll very much enjoy that. If you don't, you won't.
I read one Hemingway, and I can't remember which one it is. It's Sun Also Rises. It's the only Hemingway I've read, which is not the most well-known Hemingway, but it was, again, having the option to do it. I purposely did not choose the two well-known Hemingways. I actually found Hemingway very dull. I really didn't enjoy his work, but I understand why people like it.
I enjoy reading it because I can relate to that more than to like an F. Scott Fitzgerald. A lot of his characters are sort of rural everymen. I'm from Iowa. There's a lot of time spent just describing basic things that they do. I'm trying to think if it was In Our Time or if it was The Sun Also Rises. I think it was In Our Time, but there's a lengthy section where he just describes this a World War I veteran trying to get out into nature and get away from the city. And he just goes and spends like 12 pages describing how this guy sets up his camp and goes fishing. And although it sounds very boring, if you also need to escape from city life, just reading something like that is actually kind of relaxing and therapeutic.
Yeah, the one thing that Hemingway is good for is, assuming you find fishing relaxing, reading about fishing via Hemingway can be very relaxing.
Unless you're reading The Old Man and the Sea, which is depressing and sad.
Another one of those few books I would say that, part of my English education, a part of everybody's, was Moby Dick.
I've never read that, actually.
But I would say of the great works of, American literature, great works of sort of what you read in high school or forced to read in high school, Moby Dick was one of my favorites.
That's not Hemingway. That's not Conrad. Melville.
Yeah. The reason I joke about it is actually the scene that most stuck with me from Moby Dick is actually his description of the Whalebone Church, which most people consider to be one of the most boring sections of the book. But I actually I enjoyed Moby Dick, I think, because I enjoyed the discussions of whaling, and I found it to be a somewhat scientific discussion. Mm-hmm. This is what whaling is, how it works, and sort of stuff like that. And I found that very interesting. I actually wasn't that into the story of Moby Dick as much as I was interested in his discussions of whaling, which is most people think is sort of the worst part of Moby Dick.
Well, and it's interesting. Like, one thing I learned in law school is how much of our property law and sort of everyday nomenclature and some idioms we have is based off of the whaling industry. Like the term hard and fast is a legal term for how you establish property rights to a whale that you've harpooned, but you haven't landed it. They used to just spear the whales, knowing that they would die, and wait for them to wash ashore and then go find them and claim them based on the tags that run their harpoons. It's terrible.
There's some amazing number of idioms in the American English, maybe the best way to say it.
Yeah.
That where they come from is amazing. One of the ones I, again, sort of listening to other podcasts, they were just talking about, I think it was on Econ Talk. With that, you were talking about the fabric industry and the number of things that come from the fabric industry, like the phrase "loose ends." Which comes from the fabric industry and sort of things like that. So it's one of those where it is kind of amazing, I think, when you study those types of things. I've always sort of assumed that's why historians enjoy what they do, is you really sort of see these esoteric details which lead to stuff that's current.
Yep.
The vast majority of people just don't know.
Yeah, you have all these terms that sort of linger in language, like the word "wend," W-E-N-D. Uh-huh. It still exists only because of like two idioms we still have, like winding and wending your way, or like the moon waxes and wanes. Like those words are never used that way anywhere else.
Yeah, waxing and waning is a great example. You hardly ever see people use that term in common English, but we always talk about the waxing moon. I mean, you hear that all the time, or the waning moon.
Let's talk about one more work of literature that's a little, I don't know, I wouldn't say more interesting, but its status is sort of unclear. Mein Kampf by this guy named Adolf Hitler was published in 1925.
Yeah, the interesting thing about it is we're not talking about any translation, with it. And the issue here is it's a book which we need to talk about because of the fact that it was published in 1925. That's the timing as to what it was, and something we have to deal with in conjunction with this. We don't want to say we're saying anything about the book of being something you should read or anything along those lines, but the idea of saying it is a very relevant book for its time period that we need to talk about.
So the German version was published in 1925, but then a sort of sanitized English language version was circulated later in the United States that removed some of the more heinous and objectionable elements of the original, such as Hitler's plan for Nazi domination of the world. Sort of a key point of that book.
And the thing with it's interesting about it, and again, we're getting a lot of this from the Duke Law webpage that has the things with this. There were a number of other versions that were published, and again, we're talking about a work that was originally obviously in German, and translations can have separate copyrights. That's one of the things. The reason to talk about this is just because the works underlying. The underlying work is now in public domain does not mean that any individual translation of it is. Now, again, that means you could get the work in its original language and perform your own translation. Nobody can stop you from doing that, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can make a copy of anybody else's translation. Yep. And this is a particularly good work to be illustrating it with it because the translations that were made into English in the United States tended to alter it. Either to sanitize it or to point out the fact of what wasn't sanitized in it.
Well, we should say, at the time before we got pulled into World War II, there's those famous pictures of like Nazi rallies in Times Square. Yeah, the full scope of
Madison Square Garden.
The full scope of Nazi atrocities were not widely known at the time. I don't recall how widely they were known at all prior to the war outbreaking. But there was a large amount of Nazi sympathizers in the U.S. who saw Germany as perhaps a useful blunt instrument to go after Soviet communism, which they found at least, if not more, frightening. So it's not surprising that somebody who got a hold of that would have said, somebody sympathetic to Germany's military ambitions in Europe would have thought, well, let's spread that around here and try and garner some support. But what ended up happening, and we're getting all this from the Duke website, they've done a nice job researching this. A reporter named Alan Cranston, who they say later became a senator, had read the original German language version and noticed that the U.S. versions did not have all of the more horrifying details of Hitler's plan. And so he released an unabridged version that had all of that in English. But then refused to pay any royalties to Hitler for it.
Which actually I think is great because at the time there was a lot of disputes over, paying royalties across.
That's one of those things you wouldn't think about, right? Like, well, yeah, of course you're going to publish it here. And of course you're not going to pay royalties to Hitler. I mean,
But I think it's a really interesting comment of the idea that he in some sense that was an act of protest to not pay royalties, and it's a very effective act of protest if you think about it.
Yeah, and then so this was 1939 that this happened. He sold his unauthorized translation for, it says, 10 cents, which undercut the market for the authorized and sanitized version. Then it says he was sued for copyright infringement and lost in court. I kind of want to look up that case now and see who the plaintiff was. Like, I assume it wasn't Adolf Hitler at the time. I would assume it was some U.S. publisher who had the rights. He didn't have any damages, but he was ordered to stop selling the book. So it's an interesting little tale there. And Kirk and I were talking a couple weeks ago about this. What would have happened to Hitler's copyright to Mein Kampf after that? He had no heirs. I don't think he had any brothers or sisters. So what happens to his rights? Do they just die with him?
Yeah, and so that's, I think, one of the interesting things is you could look at this case and say, well, the rights may have existed. The other thing the Duke website goes into,
not that anybody cares, right? Nobody's sympathetic to Hitler's copyright claims.
But one of the things they actually talk about here, I think, is useful is the work may actually never have been registered in the United States. And even to the extent that it's registered, it may not have been renewed. There was, in order to be the term for 2021, you have to have renewed your copyright. So it may very well have entered the public domain long before now. Yeah. But people are talking about it because it is a work of 1925. But it's one of those things where you kind of look at it and say, but to the extent that there were some kind of royalties owed, who are they owed to? And actually, this is a large problem generally at the Copyright Office with what are called orphan works, where people bump in and say, hey, I found this book. For example, I would like to make this into a movie. It still should be under copyright. I want to pay whoever I need to pay. How do I get license fees? And they simply cannot locate who owns the rights in the book or if there are any rights in the book. And they're called orphan works. It is a major problem in conjunction with the Copyright Office, and one they're trying to resolve recently, where they're trying to now create essentially funds where somebody who wants to do this would pay into a fund for a certain
the royalty
time.
would be like a typical rate,
typical reasonable royalty. And then if somebody who could come forward and say, I am the legitimate owner of the rights in this copyright, you can get the funds out of that orphan works fund. If nobody comes forward in a certain window of years, they're returned to the original payer as to what it is. So it is an interesting thing that the orphan works is a major problem in copyright, because copyrights are so long and most of the term is post the life of the author.
And for some types of works, it's even a bigger problem. Like in literature, you can usually figure out who the author is. It's a written work. But we do have a lot of things like song recordings, which until 1972 were entirely state law. If you have a random recording laying around, it's not easy just from the recording, if you don't have any more information about it, to figure out who it's by, who the performer was, and thus who you have to contact to get the rights to use it. So part of the Music Modernization Act from a couple of years ago was to add the orphaned work, or add musical works to the orphaned work registry too. So these issues with public domain, what is or is not, you'll see people on the internet boldly and unequivocally describing how public domain works. Be suspicious when you see that. It should be apparent even from at this point that like it's not always that simple. Mein Kampf and really anything before 1976 is a good example. The U.S. Copyright Act was completely scrapped and rewritten in 1976. So when all of this stuff was being done, it was under the prior act that Teddy Roosevelt signed into law in, I think, 1911 maybe, or 1909.
1909 sounds right.
Yeah, and it worked very differently. It had a shorter term. It required frequent registration. You had to give certain notices so you could lose the copyright. So there are works that had longer term and just didn't take advantage of them all for failure to comply with formal and statutory requirements. A lot of those formalities were removed from the 1976 Act. So modern stuff doesn't accidentally slip into the public domain like that. It's almost impossible. But before that, it could happen, and Mein Kampf and other works may have had that happen where whoever was in charge. I mean, can you imagine if you're the U.S. publishing outfit in say 1950, owns the publishing rights to Mein Kampf, and someone says, "Are we renewing this?" I mean,
no.
Yeah,
because you obviously have no intention of publishing it. It's valueless at that point in time to you, presumably. To sell inside the United States.
It's certainly not something you're going to want to go try to make a profit off of.
Yeah.
You might distribute it for academic and educational use and things like that. But yeah, so the Mein Kampf is a peculiar case. Other things in the public domain, not a ton of movies yet. We're looking at the list. There's some in here. There's some I've heard of. One of the main ones was Go West by Buster Keaton.
Yep.
Never seen it, but I have heard of it at least.
I know a lot of Buster Keaton. I happened to take an intro film studies when I was at college, actually, where I met my wife in the end. We watched quite a bit of Buster Keaton. And so it was one of those where in the course of doing it, I know Go West is one of them. But yeah, you were talking silent film era, obviously, that's for his thing. So it's, well-known works, famous works. One of the interesting things about it is, and I've wondered about this in conjunction with copyrights. You've got to keep in mind that copyrights for movies and movies with sound, particularly music in the background. So when we're talking about like a Buster Keaton movie where the entire soundtrack is music, there is no, spoken words over it. It's a silent movie. Sync licensing, which is connecting the two together, is subject to some slightly different copyright rules. And so I think it's interesting to also play around with a possible public domain of exactly how it's going to work with both the music or the soundtrack and the visuals going together versus going apart. Obviously, the film is going to be based upon the timing, but the timing of the music in the background could actually be different. So that's one of the things I think is also an intriguing concept. You may have a soundtrack to a movie that actually loses its or gains public domain status before the movie to which it's associated actually gains public domain status.
Yeah, and we've got some music too. I'm kind of going through the list here. A lot of jazz and early blues. Of note, a couple of works by Bessie Smith, who, if you're not familiar with her, was one of maybe the most popular and famous vocalists of her era, at least for jazz and blues music. She's one of those performers where if you heard a song by her, you recognize it. Very, very distinctive. Fats Waller, Duke Ellington, others are on this list.
W.C. Handy.
Yes, W.C. Handy. I keep waiting to see, Irving Berlin, some of his works. So I keep waiting to see, what's the one that we always talk about when we talk about the Sonny Bono Act? Gershwin.
Yeah, there's a Gershwin in here. There's a Gershwin in here, Looking for a Boy.
Yeah.
From Tiptoes, which is a musical. I have to admit, I don't particularly know. I used to be kind of seriously into musicals, and that's a musical I don't know, so it's kind of surprising. But
Rhapsody in Blue was last year. It was 1924.
Okay, yeah, I thought that was a major one from last year.
So lots of stuff. Just Google Public Domain Day 2021. You'll find lists of some of the more famous works and a lot of discussion of the Hitler copyright, which it sounds like a Saturday Night Live skit kind of. And there's also there's a lot of other works that are less popular but are still out there, and you'll run into them. So it's worth taking a look at. One thing we should mention briefly is, in the U.S., for all practical purposes, copyrights are expire now based on the original publication date. But there are places in the world that are still primarily driven by the life of the author standard. And so for those places, you're looking at authors who died either in 1950, if the term is life plus 70, or maybe be even more recent, 1970 for life plus 50 countries. So one of those is Burroughs, who wrote Tarzan. So in those countries, Tarzan is now public domain, although I think it might already be in the U.S. The novel, again, not the any of the films that you may have seen. So lots of interesting things going on. Google that, check it out, and then we should also say be careful, especially with music. We've mentioned books where it's usually easy to tell if there's some additional copyrighted material that's been added to the original. But with music and to some extent film, it can be trickier because you don't always know if the works have been remastered or retouched or cleaned up in some way to a sufficient degree that whoever did it has acquired a separate independent copyright on the retouched or remastered work, which can happen, even though it's the exact same movie. That can certainly happen.
And there's some dispute as to exactly, how much needs to change. I know there was an argument for a while as to, was digitization of a movie sufficient to grant it a new copyright. One of the ones I know has been a little bit of a battle for a while, and I don't know if it's truly been sorted out, is whether or not the editing of a movie for television is considered sufficient to be the thing, because you have to obviously cut the movie down to a particular time window. You have to add breaks in order to deal with the advertisements. And with nowadays, it's not as big of a deal because most movies are still, most TVs are widescreen. But at the time when you had to do a pan and scan, was that sufficient? So it's one of those things where I think there's a lot of sort of intriguing things there to keep in mind with public domains. And again, one of the things to really keep in mind is who's done the recording. With music, the real downside of it is the work could readily be, the actual musical work could readily be public domain. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Yeah. I mean, which is no question that's asked public domain. The question with it is, though, is the vast majority of recordings of that
recordings are the big thing,
are actually not public domain.
we should emphasize that, especially. So for musical works, there's 2 copyrights, sometimes 3, in what we think of as a song, or what in the law is a quote unquote musical work. There's the composition, which is, what are the notes and tones and pauses that make up the melody of the song, and then there's a recording of somebody performing the song. Those are 2 different things. So if a song was written and the composition, say the sheet music was published in 1925 or earlier, that is public domain. But if a performer then picked it up and recorded it in 1931 or 1945, those recordings are not public domain, even though the underlying sheet music is. So for practical purposes, what this means is compositions, you no longer have to go get, a mechanical license to make your own recording or cover of them. But that doesn't mean that it's, open season on any recording you can find. So be careful with using recordings that you find to what may seem like a public domain work, but may not be.
And I think that sort of goes to the point earlier we talked about with public domain. It's hard to know exactly public domain. It's complicated. What public domain is very simple. What's in public domain is complicated. And I think that's the real key thing to sort of keep track of this, is it's when you say something's in the public domain, once something is definitively in the public domain, knowing what you can do with it is easy. You can do anything. And so it's easy, but it's hard to know necessarily when a particular work enters the public domain. because so much of copyright gets tangled in our various interpretations of it. So again, you can look at it and say The Great Gatsby as a novel is in the public domain, but the movies are not in the public domain. And so you have to be careful. Is it based on the novel? Is it based on the movie? Those are the kind of things where you bump into it, because what you're usually creating in these is a derivative work. And that's where the question comes, is what's in the public domain. The underlying thing has to be what's in the public domain. And so again, if you were to write a screenplay from The Great Gatsby, the novel, you're fine. If you were to write a screenplay from The Great Gatsby, the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, you may have an issue, because that movie is not in the public domain. Like, no question, that's not in the public domain. It's not old enough. And so you now bump into, well, what is your movie based on a public domain work or not? And those types of questions. Now, obviously, it's up to courts to resolve those. And, you can have issues where they can look at it and say, no, it's based on one versus the other. But it's one of those where when you see somebody who says something like, well, everything's in the public domain, these kind of things are all public domain, you really have to be a bit cautious about that, of really knowing what it is that's in the public domain.
Yeah, the Great Gatsby is a good example of that. It's possible to write an original screenplay adaptation of the novel The Great Gatsby that still hews too closely to the 2013 Leonardo DiCaprio interpretation to infringe the copyright on the movie by copying the visual and stylistic elements of that film and pointing back and saying, no, it entered the public domain in 1925. Yeah, the book did, but you're not being sued by F. Scott Fitzgerald's heirs. You're being sued by whoever owns the rights to 2013 Great Gatsby movie. So you have to still be careful. You can't just copy anything you find. The novel entered the public domain. The films have not. And to the extent that the films have independently copyrightable materials, they are subject to their own term and can still be enforced. So it creates real messy problems sometimes. Let's shift gears here real quick, and then we'll have to wrap it up because we're getting close to my hard break. We have a new president of the United States, and with new presidents usually comes new patent office personnel.
Yep, and that is coming because as of, I believe it was Monday, the head of the patent office did resign. Andre
Jansu.
Yeah. Yep, did resign as the head of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and new people have taken over. I know you have the exact term. There's a particular term they're using.
Yeah, so
taken over
until the actual. So we should say that the patent office used to be just run by the commissioner of patents, and some time ago they added a new position, which is the director of the patent office. And then there's a commissioner for the patent side of the house and a commissioner for the trademark side of the house. And the patent commissioner right now is Drew Hirschfeld. I forget what his last name is. And then Andre Jansu was the director, who's appointed by the president. Jansu has resigned, which is typical, and it's normal for a new president to come in and assign a new director to the PTO. President Obama did this, President Trump did it, and now President Biden is going to do it. We don't know, or at least I haven't seen yet, who he's going to appoint. I haven't even seen like a short list or anything like that. Most people don't follow this kind of thing that closely because it's not political and you can't get very mad about it. So no one cares. But in the meantime, someone still has to fulfill that role, because when patents issue, the director, by statute, I believe, has to sign the patent. Yeah. And so somebody has to at least have that responsibility. But I learned this week. There is an official regulation, I believe, governing what it means to be the quote unquote acting officer of any U.S. government position, and that also requires a special procedure to be appointed. So since Jansu has resigned, Drew Hirschfeld has been placed in that responsibility, but technically he's not the acting director. He is the person currently fulfilling the roles and responsibilities of the director, which is, I guess, something different. So yeah, this is just a lesson in bureaucratic nomenclature.
Yeah, it's interesting as a legal podcast, as we're talking about some of the stuff associated with the law. This is law. They can't call him the acting director because that term has legal meaning. Yeah,
there's legal consequences, and for all I don't know what all that means. I never worked for the federal government in any reasonable capacity, but it could be something like, once you do that, you're entitled to a federal pension or something like that, or So they're very careful about this kind of stuff and following the formalities. It'll be interesting to see who President Biden appoints. I do remember when President Trump took office, there was a bit of not really like a dust up, but some confusion about what was going on because we had different government websites said different things about the current status of Director Lee, who was President Obama's appointee. And I think some of the websites said she was still director. Some had said she wasn't. And at some point, a couple of patent lawyers filed a Freedom of Information Act request with one question: who's running the PTO?
Yeah.
And the government, I think, was either unwilling or unable to answer it. And this was, it's not a purely academic question. Again, whoever is in charge of the PTO signs the patents. So if Director Lee is no longer the director and she's signing the patents, then does that make those patents invalid? I mean, these are real questions people had. It all got worked out, and it wound up being a whole bunch of nothing. But this is the kind of stuff that lawyers obsess over.
Yeah, these, as we joke about it, and we've joked about it a couple of times in conjunction with it, these are what we refer to as law school exam questions. So if you ever go to law school, these are the kind of things they love to ask you on exams is, in the event that, a person who is not the director of the Patent and Trademark Office signed a patent, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Because it's sort of an area of legal esoteria that is interesting to speculate on, even though it would probably never actually go to a court.
The circumstance where it comes up is where you happen to have a patent enforced against you that was issued on like January 22nd, signed by Director Lee, and you challenge the validity of the patent on this very technical ground that that Michelle Lee was no longer the director, had no authority, therefore the patent's invalid. I think it's, I'm hypothesizing here, but Kirk, correct me if you think I'm wrong. I think it's extremely unlikely a court would be sympathetic to that kind of argument. I think they'd say, look, it was a transition of power. Sometimes it doesn't always, go cleanly or neatly. Sometimes there's questions while we get people in place. It's a pretty typical part of the process. And we're not going to invalidate a patent by a patent owner who did nothing wrong on grounds that the federal government is sometimes disorganized.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the same questions I had. We were actually talking about it. We watched the inauguration, and I noted in the inauguration, they swore in Vice President Harris. Then they had a song. Then they swore in President Biden. The Constitution, if I remember rightly, specifically states that the transition occurs at noon.
Regardless of the swearing in. Yeah.
Regardless of the swearing in and everything else. But what does it mean to the extent that you have, is Vice President Harris Vice President to Donald Trump for 30 seconds in the course of that, depending on exactly sort of what occurs in there. And again, this is kind of the law school question. You can see the sort of question coming in as, if something was to happen where somebody was assassinated at high noon, who becomes president for the 1 second that needs to be dealt with, those kind of intriguing questions that you get into. And so you bump into these sort of, weird like legal questions as to what it is. But, they don't necessarily have any answers, but are very intriguing. And that's one I just happened to note that I thought it was interesting that they not only do, they obviously take some time to do the physical inauguration and the swearing in, but that they purposely put a gap in it. To have a song between there. What does that mean if something had happened in the gap?
I think I don't know this. I'm not an expert at all on like presidential law, but I believe the changeover happens automatically at noon. So at 11:59 and 59 seconds a.m., President Trump and President Pence are still in charge, and then 1 second later, it's President Biden and Vice President Harris. So I think whether they're sworn in or not, that happens. You got to get sworn in eventually, but that's the same with all federal officers at that level, at least. So I think that's why I always found the QAnon theory, conspiracy theory, so bizarre. They're like, they're going to arrest Biden. I'm like, well, even if they do, then he becomes president in jail. I mean, that's what the Constitution says. So it's so. We had an episode we did. I think it was in the first season. We talked about the sovereign citizen movement and some of the bizarre like theories that they have about flag fringes, and like if there's a flag in court and it's facing the wrong way, then it means you're in some kind of maritime court, and all this weird exaltation of like legal formalities that don't actually exist in real law. Where like if it's all capital letters, that means that your name is a corporation, and when you're born, they create some shell corporation, and don't ever sign your name and not in all capitals because it means they're referring to the corporation with your name, and none of that is real. Okay, that's all nonsense.
Just to use one that's actually really interesting in conjunction with that, because it's being IP lawyers and talk about IP. Anybody who notes a word trademark. So if you actually have a word trademark in the United States, when word trademarks if you go to the United States Patent and Trademark Office and you look up any word trademark, so not something that has a logo associated with it in any way, but just which is a collection of letters, they are always presented in all capital letters. Now that's partially because capitalization doesn't matter in a word trademark, but they're always presented in all capital letters. You will never see one in lowercase letters. And so that's another sort of intriguing thing of like, well, what would it mean if they published your trademark in lowercase letters? Well, the answer is they never will.
Nothing. Because when you file it, you say that I'm claiming the trademark regardless of capitalization, font, color, style, any of that. I'm claiming the word, not the way that it looks.
And that is the definition of a word trademark.
Yeah.
I mean, if you file it otherwise, it's a stylized presentation, which says, I do care about capitalization. I do care about font, stuff like that.
Yeah. Did you follow any of that QAnon stuff? It's kind of fascinating, really, the stuff that they come up with. Like they should quit their job as conspiracy theorists and just write novels.
Well, it's actually one of the things that I always comment about. Is I said one of the things that most intrigues me about like a lot of the Manchurian Candidate theories that they have with it. And I always said Manchurian Candidate theories were, and I think I've said this in a prior podcast even, weren't great as movies because everybody has a script of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
The problem when you talk about them sort of in a real life world, like the Manchurian Candidate, if you think about the idea of creating a Manchurian Candidate, the odds of something going wrong in the course of the person's lifetime, which throws it so it doesn't work anymore, is a fascinating thing. And actually the one, if you're into it, I'd suggest reading, I don't know the author, I don't know what it was, a book I read in college that was recommended by my wife, is a book called The Second Lady. And what it is it's actually about, and as much enough, the second lady is technically the usual vice president's wife.
Mm-hmm.
We have the second gentleman. I found out that's the correct term for him.
Oh, I was wondering about that.
I was wondering about it too, actually. He's the second gentleman.
I don't even know his name. What's Mr. Harris's name?
I can't remember.
I don't even know.
But guess how important we think he is.
No offense, Mr. Harris, if you're listening.
But the thing with it is that they actually, it's a foreign conspiracy where they replace the first lady with a spy, essentially, that's going to be there. And the challenge of it is they have orchestrated around it, because she's only going to be there for a certain window of time, things that she can't do because she doesn't know what the first lady behaves with.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually primarily, interesting enough, focuses around sex. That's the thing sort of that they do in a lot of conjunction with it. But there's a number of other things that she can't do because they have no way of knowing how the first lady behaves in these situations, because there's situations which has no public portion of them. So the second lady has to purposefully stay out of those situations. And that's the thing, is they orchestrate some of this, but in the course of orchestrating some of it, things go somewhat wrong in the course of doing it. And suddenly and the story's told sort of as the second lady of her trying to damage control, trying to figure out how do I behave the way the first lady would behave, not knowing how the first lady will behave, and can I do it? And as a spoiler alert, I'm going to give a little bit away about the book at the end. The key thing at the book at the end is they are in the process of, they're going to transition back from the second lady to the first lady and make this whole transition work. In a terrorist bomb, it blows up Air Force One and kills one of them.
And we don't know which one.
And that's the issue in conjunction with it, is that one survives. Nobody,
it's just like a Mission Impossible storyline.
Yeah. Nobody knew the other one existed except for these small people. They don't know which one is. And because the second lady had already navigated through all the problems of trying to deal with being the first lady in the private situations, nobody else will know. And so the key question with this is which one survives, and it's impossible to know.
Wow.
So it's a really great book. If those of you want to read it, I did just give away the ending. But I would recommend it as sort of a cool book. I always think it's like what the Manchurian Candidate should be, because they're literally only doing it for like 2 weeks, and it's fraught with peril of the fact that there's all these things going on that they just don't know about.
So along those lines, if you like that kind of storyline, this is an older film, but my wife and I saw that Jordan Peele film Us. Jordan Peele is a really interesting writer and director. He does a lot of horror / thriller type movies, but from a uniquely African-American perspective. So you get a different type of film than you get from a typical horror film. Us was truly terrifying. It didn't make a lot of sense, but it's a horror film, so it doesn't really have to. But it's expertly made, and that man has a talent for framing a shot and building up suspense and using really the lack of motion and just basic psychological tricks to present a very compelling and just terrifying setting. So if you like that kind of thing, check out Us. It was very good. Watch it in the daylight though. It scared the crap out of me. And I don't usually scare easy in horror films.
I just looked at it quick. So Irving Wallace is the author of the Second Lady. Interesting enough, I Googled Second Lady quick and forgot to type novel, and of course got a ton of Google hits on our current what Second Lady means is a general term. But yeah, I think it's an interesting thing with it. But yeah, it's interesting to talk about Us. That's actually a list on my horror movies I really want to see, because I keep hearing from people saying it's a wonderful horror movie. I just watched, interestingly enough, from talking about, sort of things and doing things in the pandemic, I happened to have just watched, I wanted to watch a sort of good horror movie and needed to find something. So I actually watched 28 Days Later. I didn't watch the entire thing because I remember when I saw it the first time, I found the ending to be a bit disappointing of sort of, where it went. But I watched a lot of the beginning. I actually watched until they get to the military safe house, which is when I thought the film kind of jumped the shark at times. But one of the things I thought was so interesting, and if you're into this kind of thing with it, is what it was. Watching him walk through London at the beginning, and him learning about the pandemic, which is 28 Days Later creation, the zombie pandemic that creates it, the rage. One of the things I think is really interesting is comparing what he sees and the way people react to that to sort of current what we see and the way we react to that. And the thing that really struck me is him standing in front of the bulletin board, the news board, at the famous news shop in London, and the notices that are up and the idea of what you see with that, and seeing like the abandoned locations and things like that. I just thought was a very interesting to see. This was obviously written, beforehand, before anybody had really experienced, the experience of living through a pandemic, especially not of that nature, but to see the uniqueness of the way he portrays it and what he thought it would be like, and seeing the similarities and the differences with it. But I thought it was a really interesting movie to watch. It was a unique perspective to see. That is also, if you haven't seen it, that is a very good movie. It's a sort of horror, scary zombie movie.
Last couple minutes here, I had one question I wanted to run by you. You and I did an episode late last year where we kind of went over all the new Star Wars stuff that's coming out, but you had not yet seen The Mandalorian Season 2 at that point. Now that you have, does it change your interest level in any of those new shows?
A little bit. The one thing I have to say with it, and it's I commented about, I really wanted to see the new Ahsoka series. I really liked Ahsoka from the Clone Wars. I was not thrilled with Ahsoka's character in The Mandalorian. I didn't think that she was portrayed that well. It's what it is. And I don't know if it's just because it's unfamiliarity with the character's new, sort of things like that. But I'm curious what they're going to do with her personality. Her personality didn't seem to mesh very well with what you saw in the Clone Wars, but she's also much older.
A lot has happened.
Yeah. And obviously has lived through an enormous change. I mean, in the Clone Wars, like the Republic's still good, and so, sort of stuff like that, she's working with stormtroopers on a daily basis. But yeah, so I was a little curious as to exactly where does that go, because I actually did find her portrayal in The Mandalorian a little bit disappointing. But it was also, she was a secondary character. She was there because they needed to advance this sort of particular plot line. There were parts of what she did that I really liked. But I just found that I'm curious as to where that's going to go, and I hope it goes well. The other thing is, somewhere in it, we talked about the Bad Batch as well, and one of the other ones being Rogue Squadron. I've seen a little bit more sort of in conjunction with both Mandalorian and with watching a little more Clone Wars. Those have intrigued me a little bit more now as possibilities, much more. I think, they were at the time I was kind of lukewarm, especially on Bad Batch. I'm not quite as lukewarm on those anymore. I'm starting to think maybe those could be also potentially interesting stories, and I'm curious to see where they go.
So now it's my turn to get caught up. I've only seen like 2 episodes of the Clone Wars, and Ahsoka is in them. And I agree, even from my limited exposure to the character, I found the portrayal in Mandalorian, I wouldn't say disappointing, but a little jarring. And I didn't know if I just don't know the character well enough, but it did not connect well thematically. Like it could have been any character, right? I don't know why that it didn't have to be Ahsoka. And I just assumed it was because they wanted to have some continuity with the other series. So maybe they'll fill in some backstory when they develop what will inevitably be her quest to find Grand Admiral Thrawn and explain how she got to be the way that she was. So we'll see. I mean, we saw that with Luke, right? In episode 8, he'd become this bitter old man on an island that was doing his best Bernie Sanders sitting in the cold impression.
For those of you who haven't seen it, you definitely need to check out the meme of Bernie Sanders sitting in the cold.
They call it Cold Man Sanders.
My favorite one of it was commenting about they had I saw a meme today showing a picture, and it showed two people sitting at a desk, one of whom's kind of sitting there looking bored and has underneath him watching the Biden inauguration, and the next one underneath it is a woman, and she has the mass of microphones in front of her, and it has watching Bernie Sanders, which I thought was kind of hilarious as to what we saw with it. But yeah, again, the thing I had with Ahsoka, and the thing I saw in conjunction with other movies, was I know it's also at the end of Clone Wars, at least I've heard from this, there is supposed to be a showdown between her and Anakin. which is supposed to be a very tragic scene. And so I'm curious about if that would also, alter it to make her make more sense, because I haven't made it that far through Clone Wars yet. If that is possibly, where it is in the idea that she's got that tragic, because obviously the character she is in Clone Wars is a very hopeful, and slightly naive in some respects character. It works very well as a foil for Anakin and a foil for Ben. But it doesn't necessarily, sort of fit what we saw in Mandalorian. But at the same time, as we said, Mandalorian is set much later. It's set with, an enormous global spanning conflict.
Mm-hmm. That saw the Jedi exterminated. She may have taken that personally.
Every friend she has is dead. At the hands of her mentor. So it's one of those things like you have it's okay. Like you can definitely see some change in her character, but it was a bit jarring as to just sort of what it was. And again, I think it's also, she doesn't have that much screen time in that particular episode because she is a side character. We don't get a lot of the intro. We don't get a lot of the backstory. I'm still curious to see where it's going to go. What I did really like in that episode is I thought the portrayal of the woman being the arms dealer that, they're sort of associated with in conjunction with it. And the idea that there are these very powerful individuals within the Empire, within the Republic, within the old New Republic, New Republic, that are extremely powerful, that are kind of like regional warlords type of thing. Also, I really liked her. And I also think that's part of the reason why Ahsoka is kind of done, is I think her character is very interesting as well. And so you kind of, in some sense, she didn't just get upstaged. She got upstaged by the Mandalorian, by Baby Yoda, and by the villain. For the purposes of that particular plot, it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Indeed. All right. Well, that's all I've got for today. And I don't have my readout sheet in front of me, so I can't do our usual outro. So I will just say for our next episode, we have not decided what we're going to do yet. In the back, I haven't talked to Kirk about this yet, but in the back of my mind, we should probably do a deep dive at some point into Google v. Oracle. That decision will be coming out. People are interested in it. It is going to be inaccurately reported all over the place by the media. I already know that much about it. And then I've been threatening to do a net neutrality episode since basically our first episode, and I've never really circled back to it. And sometime a while back, I promised to explain why the Marconi Radio Company and the Titanic tell you everything you need to know about net neutrality. So we'll try and get to that. And there may be some changes to our net neutrality policies under the new administration, because that all falls under the combination of the FCC and the FTC. And Ajit Pai, who was the architect of our current net neutrality policies, has rotated off the board. So there may be some changes coming there, and that will probably be in the news in the next 12 months. So we'll probably return to that issue as well, and whatever else we think of. So that's all I've got. Kirk, any last thoughts today?
I think that's sort of the end of my thoughts. I definitely like the idea of doing this sort of public domain episode. It's not something we necessarily talk about. We talk about copyright, I think, more than we intend to a lot of times, because it's just interesting and has a lot of interesting questions.
And it's easy.
It's
There's a lot of it.
There's a lot of it. But, I think it's one of those where there are a lot of sort of intriguing IP issues. And like we talked briefly about the director of the Patent and Trademark Office here, there's a lot of IP issues and a lot of sort of things that have major impact in the IP world that the general public really doesn't see. Anybody who's listening to this that isn't a lawyer and actually knew that, Yansu. I started trying to say his first name and then mixed the two names together. Yansu had stepped down, I would be amazed. Is this kind of thing. It's a sort of, quiet thing, but
it's not a headline grabbing development,
Yeah. But to people who are, involved in the Patent and Trademark Office every day, this is a major event, as to what's going on. So there's a lot of like IP law that goes on in the background that people just don't see. And I think that's one of the things that's a real fundamental theme of this episode.
Yeah, for sure.
There's so much stuff that goes on that people don't see or don't completely understand that is interesting.
All right. That's all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.
And then his arch rival is the football player Tom Buchanan. What would he? I guess he'd be a Klingon.
Klingon's a little bit too boisterous. My immediate take with it, and again, I've seen the movie, so I remember a bit of it.
Yeah.
My take is almost making him more like Romulan, so he's more manipulative. And again, I'm thinking Romulan actually from Picard. The Romulans that are portrayed in that, I actually really like the way they're portraying the Romulans in that. The Romulans are like what the KGB is when we make it work really well in the future.